Hello to everyone. I see that a couple more of my colleagues have arrived. Rich L. Bagley, co-composer for The Star Thrower. Donna Wissinger, our magical flutist. Mark Rice, our chairman of the board from the Renaissance Center and my buddy from RPI. And let's see, Jim Steller is currently a professor of neuroscience at the University at Albany. And when I first got to know him, was provost and interim president of the university. And he happens to have a very special connection to the Lauren Isley organization by virtue of his mother's close friendship with Isley when Jim was a rather young fellow, I think in his college years. When Jim's father was provost at UPenn, Lauren Isley had a decade before held that position himself, found that he didn't like senior administration and went back to being a professor. Was lucky to have Jim's father and mother as dear friends. And we'll hear from Jim Steller and perhaps a couple of stories from his early memories of Lauren Isley. So perhaps I should jump into what I'm supposed to be talking about here this afternoon, and that is the Star Thrower story and how we went about making it into an opera. Back in 1991, 1992, when our company Creative Leaps International was in its infancy, we had the great opportunity to collaborate with the renowned Center for Creative Leadership out of Greensboro, North Carolina, arguably the foremost center for leadership and creativity studies anywhere in the US. Their president and vice president, Walt Ulmer and Stan Griskevich, were invited to a place here in upstate New York called Silver Bay on Lake George to keynote a conference on leadership for leaders from the business sector out of New York City. And my colleagues and I had also been invited to develop a special concert of ideas, as we called it, to amplify on the keynote message of the day. The long and the short of it was our concert of ideas was very well received. Walt Ulmer's talk was brilliant, and he invited our Young Creative Leaps organization to partner with the Center for Creative Leadership over a succession of projects that actually ran for 10 years. But the very first project was their upcoming Creativity and Innovation Networking Conference, which they were about to host the following spring. And they invited me to CCL to convene with the organizers of that event. And the upshot of that was the request that we repeat the concert of ideas they had seen up at Lake George, Silver Bay. They liked that very much, but also wanted to commission a new work about creativity itself and the implications it has for leadership. And all we needed was a literary piece to set to music, and that would be premiered at this upcoming event. On the way back to the airport, Stan Griskevich, the senior vice president of CCL, was brainstorming with me as to what that piece of literature might be. And he said, John, on the back seat of my car, maybe you could find it. There's a two-page description of a story that I like to share, which is a kind of leadership parable. Maybe you're familiar with it. So I reached in the back seat, found this two-page summary, read it ever so quickly, and lo and behold, it was a short version of the Star Thrower story. And I said, Stan, you are not going to believe this, but in my own briefcase is my copy of the original book from which that Star Thrower story comes, Lauren Isley's collection of essays, The Unexpected Universe. Well, that was all we needed to know. It seemed that the gods had suddenly provided us a sense of direction. And we knew at that point that together with my colleagues, Richard and John, we would endeavor to set this essay to music. So this was 19 92, and over the next few months, we completed the work, and I'll talk to you a little bit later about the process of composing the work. But for now, to tell you that it was wonderfully well received by that audience of creativity experts and really solidified the partnership that ran for 10 years and has actually continued another 20 years with our young company of Creative Leaps International and the wonderful Center for Creative Leadership in Greensboro, North Carolina. So that's our origin story for how it was that that particular piece, that essay by Isley, got to be selected for the Creativity Project. Now, if I may, I'd like to turn our attention to the essay itself. I imagine that many of you, if not all of you, have read the essay and are familiar with it, but perhaps some of you are not. And so I want to suggest that the Star Thrower story carries within it a number of parables, as it were, which are teaching tools or ways to set our minds in motion, exploratory motion, on the subjects of leadership, on the subject of our relationship to nature, and also the world of science and the gifts that it brings to us through analysis and creativity. Isley touches upon all of these things rather profoundly in the course of the story, and his phenomenal gift for language and description makes it a real page turner. From the very beginning, I'm going to share with you the opening lines of the essay. He says, "It has ever been my lot, though formerly myself a teacher, to be taught surely by none. Nevertheless, I venture to say that of what man may be, I have caught a fugitive glimpse, not among multitudes of men, but along an endless wave-beaten coast at dawn." And if you're not caught by that sentence, it'd be pretty hopeless. I was dragged in, riveted to this wonderful way of writing, and felt that as we began to set it to music, I couldn't paraphrase Isley, that we absolutely needed to use his own language as every single word of the narration and the sung lyrical text that would be featured in our miniature opera or musical dramatization, as we call it. The leadership parable, since that was the reason the work was commissioned, is really worth exploring. Now, who is the leader that is the model within this story? Of course, it's the Star Thrower character himself, who hardly says more than 10 words that ultimately shift Isley in his thinking. But what he does have is a sure sense of purpose and a deep conviction for his purpose. He's collecting starfish stranded on the beaches, living starfish, and tossing them back into the sea, rescuing them, giving them another chance to survive, to live. Not so much to create them, but almost to recreate their path forward. And he does it one life form at a time, one little starfish at a time. And in the world of leadership, this personal approach of a highly committed sense of purpose, applied one person at a time, is one of the most powerful and beautiful messages that comes out of this Star Thrower story. All of us, I'm sure, are familiar with the way in which the Star Thrower story underscores the human role within the larger scope of nature. Are we simply to be consumers of every other life form? Or is our relationship to the multiplicity of forms on the earth one of being part of a larger family and having a certain responsibility, as Isley says multiple times, I love the small ones, perhaps the weak ones, the ones who need my assistance, my help. And that reverence for other forms of life becomes part of what certainly we absorb through reading the story ourselves. The work that Eiseley contributed in his field of anthropology and archaeology, that scientific work, is certainly something of immense scholarship, but something which also seemed to strip Eiseley for a time of his heartfelt sense of values. And he referred to the work of the sciences as governed by a cold analytical eye. And I think the sciences have broadened considerably since the 1970s to really embrace the wider sense of nature. The whole field of ecology has pretty much evolved since that time. But Eiseley needed to make space, in his view, for the humanistic vision of our place within the larger scope of Earth life form. This comes across ever so beautifully through the story of our star thrower.